Hello and welcome back to Infidelity Tales Lab. We're grateful for each view and comment. Tell us, from which country or city are you watching today? We enjoy connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundations of Sand. Victor Sullivan stood at the edge of his 10-acre property, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. At 42, he had built everything through relentless work and calculated risk. The construction empire he'd created from nothing now employed over 200 people. He'd married Diana Harlow 15 years ago when she was a struggling art student, and he was just starting to gain traction with his first major development project. "You're brooding again," a voice called from behind him. Victor turned to see Diana approaching, her auburn hair catching the fading light. At 38, she still looked stunning, though lately something had changed in her eyes, a distant quality he couldn't quite identify. "Just thinking," he replied, taking a sip from his whiskey glass. "Thompson wants to back out of the River Heights deal." Diana's smile faltered slightly. "The one you've been working on for months? Can he do that?" "He can try," Victor said, his voice hardening. "But I didn't get where I am by letting people walk all over me." Diana nodded, then checked her phone as it buzzed. A slight frown crossed her face before she quickly composed herself. "I need to head into town tonight. The gallery is having issues with a new exhibition setup." Victor raised an eyebrow. "The third late night emergency this month. On a Saturday night? Can't your assistant handle it? Tanya's out of town this weekend. It won't take long." She kissed his cheek, the gesture feeling somehow performative. "Don't wait up." As she walked away, Victor noticed the slight spring in her step. Something about her eagerness nagged at him. Their marriage had grown colder over the past year, with Diana increasingly absorbed in her art gallery business. He'd initially supported her venture with both capital and connections, proud of her ambition. Lately, though, they'd become like ships passing in the night. Victor's phone rang. His site manager, Liam Bennett. "Boss, we have a situation at the Westlake site. Some of the materials delivered aren't up to code. I'll be there in 30, Victor said, downing the rest of his whiskey. As he drove toward the construction site, his mind kept returning to Diana's behavior. 3 months ago, he'd overheard her laughing on the phone, a sound he hadn't heard directed at him in longer than he cared to admit. When he'd entered the room, she'd quickly ended the call. At the construction site, Victor methodically addressed the materials issue, negotiating with the supplier over the phone with the same ruthless efficiency that had built his reputation. By the time he finished, it was nearly midnight. On a whim, instead of heading home, he drove toward Diana's gallery in town. The building was dark. No emergency, no staff working late. Victor sat in his truck, staring at the empty gallery, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. He pulled out his phone and opened the location-sharing app they'd installed years ago for convenience. Diana's location showed her at the Westfield, an upscale hotel on the other side of town. Victor drove there slowly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He parked across the street and waited, watching the entrance. At 1:17 a.m., Diana emerged, laughing, her hand intertwined with a tall man Victor recognized immediately. Nolan Prescott, the smooth-talking art dealer who had begun supplying pieces to Diana's gallery 6 months ago. They kissed passionately under the hotel awning before Nolan hailed a cab. Diana stood, watching until the taxi disappeared around the corner, a dreamy smile on her face. Then she walked to her car. Victor sat motionless, a glacier forming in his chest where his heart should be. He didn't follow her. Instead, he started his truck and drove to his office downtown. There, in the silence of his corner office overlooking the sleeping town, he poured himself another whiskey and began to think. Victor Sullivan had never been a man who acted on impulse. His success had been built on patience, strategy, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead while others struggled to see 2. He wouldn't confront Diana immediately. First, he needed information. And then, he would make a plan. Chapter 2. Paper Trails. For 2 weeks, Victor maintained the facade of normality at home while methodically investigating his wife's affair. He hired Maxwell Reed, a private investigator recommended by his attorney, to document Diana's movements and communications with Nolan Prescott. You don't seem as angry as most clients, Max observed when they met in an out-of-the-way diner to discuss findings. Victor's expression remained impassive as he reviewed the photographs of Diana and Nolan entering various hotels, their intimate dinners in neighboring towns. Anger clouds judgment, he replied, and I need to see everything clearly. The PI handed over a USB drive. 6 weeks of text messages and emails. Your tech guy came through with those. Fair warning, they get personal. That night, after Diana claimed another gallery emergency, Victor connected the drive to his laptop in his home office. The messages between his wife and her lover painted a vivid picture of not just physical betrayal, but emotional desertion. They mocked his work hours, his dedication to building the business that funded Diana's comfortable lifestyle and her gallery. Victor's so predictable, Diana had written. All he cares about is adding more zeros to his bank account. He hasn't truly seen me in years. 2 more months, Nolan had responded. Once the divorce is final and we've secured what you deserve from this marriage, we'll never have to hide again. Victor's face remained expressionless as he scrolled through their plans to take half his assets, move to New York, and build a new gallery with his money. Diana had been systematically documenting supposed grievances, fabricated claims of emotional neglect, manufactured arguments, even allegations that Victor had been verbally abusive, all carefully dated and detailed. Setting up a narrative, building a case. The next day, Victor visited his attorney, Howard Lowell, carrying a thick folder of documents. They're planning to blindside me with divorce papers soon, Victor explained, sliding the evidence across the desk. She's been creating a fictional record of mistreatment while sleeping with this art dealer. From what I've gathered, they plan to use Montana's equitable distribution laws to take half of everything, including my business. Howard reviewed the materials, his expression growing increasingly grave. This is methodical. They've been planning this for at least 8 months. He looked up. What do you want to do, Victor? Victor leaned forward. I want to understand exactly what I'm facing legally if she files with these fabricated claims. And then I want to know every possible way to protect what I've built. You could file first, Howard suggested. Get ahead of this. No, Victor said calmly. I need them to believe their plan is working. For now. That weekend, Diana suggested they host a dinner party for important gallery clients. Victor agreed amiably, playing the role of supportive husband. Among the guests was Nolan Prescott, who Victor welcomed into his home with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Throughout the evening, Victor observed the subtle glances between his wife and her lover, noting how Nolan charmed their mutual friends and how Diana beamed at him from across the room. Victor performed flawlessly as the successful, oblivious husband, even engaging Nolan in a lengthy discussion about art market investments. You have quite an eye for emerging talent, Victor told him, raising his glass in a toast. No wonder my wife values your professional opinion so highly. Later that night, after the guests had departed and Diana had gone to bed, Victor went to his office and made a phone call. I need everything, he told Max, every contact, every business dealing, every skeleton in Nolan Prescott's closet. And I need someone watching the gallery's finances. Something doesn't add up there. This is becoming more than a standard infidelity case, Max cautioned. I'm aware, Victor replied. Your discretion will be compensated accordingly. As April turned to May, Victor allowed Diana to believe that her increasingly transparent excuses were working. He listened patiently to her complaints about their marriage, recognizing each as a carefully planted seed meant to justify her impending departure. He noted how she began shifting small personal items from the house, family photographs, heirloom jewelry, sentimental objects she could claim were solely hers. What Diana didn't notice was that Victor had begun making meticulous preparations of his own. Chapter 3. The First Move. On a warm June morning, Diana finally made her move. Victor returned from an early meeting to find divorce papers on his desk, delivered by courier rather than in person. The petition painted him as a cold, controlling workaholic who had emotionally abandoned his wife. It requested half of all marital assets, including a significant stake in Sullivan Construction. Victor called Diana, who didn't answer. Her text response was brief. My lawyer advised against direct communication. This is for the best. He waited until evening to return home, finding Diana packing a suitcase in their bedroom. Were you planning to say goodbye? He asked from the doorway. Diana flinched, then squared her shoulders. I left you a letter along with the papers. I've been unhappy for years, Victor. You must have noticed. What I noticed, he said calmly, was that you've been carefully documenting false grievances while sleeping with Nolan Prescott. The color drained from Diana's face, but she recovered quickly. That's not true, and making false accusations won't help you in court. Victor didn't raise his voice. We've been married 15 years, Diana. I invested in your gallery when no one else would take the risk. I introduced you to every important connection you have. And this is how you repay loyalty. Loyalty, Diana laughed bitterly. You've been loyal to your business. Victor, never to me. When was the last time you asked about my dreams? My needs? Nolan actually sees me, not just as an accessory to his success. Nolan sees you as access to my money, Victor replied evenly. But by all means, finish packing. I won't stop you. Her expression shifted to suspicion. Just like that? No fighting for our marriage. Would it matter if I did? Diana zipped her suitcase. My lawyer says I'm entitled to half of everything. The prenup is outdated and can be challenged based on your controlling behavior. I've documented everything. Yes, Victor said. I know exactly what you've documented. Something in his tone made Diana pause, but she grabbed her suitcase and headed for the door. The court date is already set. Try not to make this uglier than it needs to be. After Diana left, Victor poured himself a whiskey and made a call to Howard. She served the papers and moved out, he said. Staying with Prescott, I assume. She's confident about breaking the prenup. Their filing was creative, Howard admitted. The judge assigned to the case is Harriet Coleman. She has a history of favoring wives in high-net-worth divorces, especially when emotional abuse is alleged. Then we have work to do, Victor replied. Implement Phase 1. The following week, Diana was unpleasantly surprised when her gallery's main supplier suddenly canceled their contract, citing business restructuring. 3 major clients postponed significant purchases. The gallery's insurance company initiated a routine audit that required extensive documentation. None of these setbacks could be directly traced to Victor, yet they created immediate financial pressure. Meanwhile, Victor appeared to be floundering. He responded to the divorce petition with a standard request for adherence to the prenuptial agreement, but otherwise made no aggressive legal moves. He looked tired in public, inspiring sympathetic glances from mutual friends who had heard Diana's version of events. He's falling apart, Diana told Nolan over dinner, showing him a text from a friend who had seen Victor at a business lunch. Howard says he's not even fighting the financial discovery requests. Nolan raised his wine glass. To new beginnings. I told you he wouldn't know what to do without you managing the social aspects of his life. What neither of them knew was that Victor had opened a new front in the war. Max had discovered that several pieces in Diana's gallery had questionable provenance. Specifically, artwork that Nolan had sourced through his international contacts. Victor had quietly commissioned authentication experts to examine documentation and ownership histories. At the first preliminary hearing, Diana sat confidently beside her attorney, Valerie Winters, a shark-like divorce lawyer known for extracting maximum settlements. Victor arrived with just Howard, lacking the team of lawyers Diana had expected. Judge Coleman frowned at Victor throughout the proceedings, particularly when Valerie presented Diana's detailed records of alleged emotional manipulation. Additionally, Your Honor, Valerie argued, Mr. Sullivan's business success was only possible due to my client's unwavering support and sacrifice of her own career aspirations. The gallery she eventually established was a mere fraction of the creative potential Mrs. Sullivan set aside to support her husband's ambitions. Victor noticed Diana dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, a performance he once would have found convincing. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Coleman addressed him directly. Do you understand that Montana law considers marriage an equal partnership? Your wife's contributions, while perhaps not directly financial, enabled your success. I understand completely, Your Honor, Victor replied respectfully. I founded Sullivan Construction before our marriage, but I've never denied my wife's support was valuable. The hearing concluded with temporary arrangements heavily favoring Diana, substantial monthly support, continued use of their vacation property, and a freeze on major business assets, pending final settlement. Outside the courthouse, Diana couldn't contain her triumph. The judge believed my lies. You get nothing. The kids hate you, she shouted as they left the courthouse steps, though they had no children, her rehearsed script slipping in her moment of perceived victory. I won. She spat on his shoes for dramatic effect. Victor said nothing, his face impassive. Then Diana's phone rang. It was Valerie. Bad news. Victor heard as he turned to leave. The judge received a package from Mr. Sullivan, and it's not good for us. Don't do anything stupid now. As Victor walked to his car, the faintest smile crossed his lips. Phase 2 was now in motion. Chapter 4. The Package. Judge Harriet Coleman sat alone in her chambers, staring at the contents of the package spread across her desk. What had seemed like a straightforward high-net-worth divorce case had just become significantly more complex. The package Victor Sullivan had submitted contained meticulously organized evidence. Authenticated text messages between Diana Sullivan and Nolan Prescott discussing their plan to fabricate abuse claims. Financial records showing Diana had been siphoning gallery funds into a personal account. Statements from household staff contradicting Diana's timeline of events. And most damning, a journal in Diana's handwriting detailing their scheme to take Victor for everything he's worth. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk entered with another folder. The supplemental filing from Mr. Sullivan's attorney just arrived, Your Honor. This second package contained evidence that 3 valuable paintings in Diana's gallery, sourced by Nolan Prescott, had questionable provenance. External authentication experts had provided affidavits suggesting they might be sophisticated forgeries. Judge Coleman removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. She had initially sympathized with Diana Sullivan, finding Victor's calm demeanor somewhat cold. Now she wondered how much her own biases had influenced her preliminary ruling. She picked up the phone to call both attorneys for an emergency hearing. Across town, Diana paced in Nolan's stylish loft apartment, her face flushed with anger. What exactly did Victor submit? She demanded as Nolan poured her a glass of wine with slightly trembling hands. Valerie doesn't know yet, Nolan replied. The judge sealed it temporarily, but she said it's bad, really bad. Valerie warned we might need to prepare for a complete reversal of the temporary orders. Diana hurled the wine glass against the wall, red liquid streaming down like blood. That's impossible. We were careful. Were we? Nolan asked quietly. You told me he was oblivious, that he was too absorbed in his business to notice anything. He was. Diana insisted, though doubt crept into her voice. For months he didn't question my excuses or late nights. Maybe, Nolan said, he was playing along. That same evening, Victor sat in Howard's office reviewing their strategy. Judge Coleman was shocked, Howard reported. She scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. The art authentication reports were particularly effective. They've opened questions about potential fraud beyond just the divorce proceedings. Victor nodded. And the financial tracking? Howard slid a document across the desk. Diana's been moving money from the gallery accounts, about $180,000 so far. Some went to her personal account, but nearly half has been transferred to offshore accounts we believe are connected to Prescott. Good, Victor said. Make sure the FBI Art Crimes Division receives the authentication reports anonymously. I want that pressure point established, but not publicly connected to me yet. Howard looked uncomfortable. Victor, I understand your desire for justice. But are you sure about this approach? Courts generally prefer clean settlements, even with evidence of misconduct. Victor's expression hardened. This stopped being about money the moment I read their messages mocking me in my own home. Diana and Nolan believe they're smarter than everyone else. I'm going to correct that misunderstanding. The emergency hearing the next morning was closed to the public. Diana arrived looking considerably less confident, with both Valerie and a white-faced Nolan flanking her. Judge Coleman got straight to the point. Mrs. Sullivan, I've reviewed evidence suggesting you fabricated abuse claims and misappropriated funds from your gallery business. Mr. Prescott, there are serious questions about the provenance of certain artworks you supplied. Before we proceed, I strongly advise both of you to consult with your attorneys about potential criminal implications. Diana started to protest, but Valerie gripped her arm tightly. Your Honor, Howard interjected smoothly. My client wishes to make it clear that his primary concern is resolving the divorce equitably. While the evidence suggests potential criminal violations, Mr. Sullivan prefers to address those matters separately from the divorce proceedings, if possible. Victor caught Diana's eye across the courtroom. For the first time, he saw fear there, the realization that she had severely underestimated him. Judge Coleman nodded gravely. I'm reversing the temporary orders effective immediately. Mrs. Sullivan, you will return any marital property in your possession. The financial freeze on Mr. Sullivan's business assets is lifted. Additionally, I'm referring the art provenance questions to appropriate authorities for investigation. Outside the courtroom, Diana approached Victor, her earlier bravado replaced by desperation. Victor, please, we need to talk privately. This has gone too far. Has it? Victor asked mildly. I'm only getting started. Nolan stepped forward. Look, Sullivan, maybe we can work something out. The gallery has potential. Diana has talent. We could structure a settlement that benefits everyone. Victor regarded him with the same expression he might give an insect. Mr. Prescott, I suggest you worry about the FBI Art Crimes Unit that's currently reviewing those 3 Degas pieces you authenticated. I understand forgery carries significant federal penalties. As color drained from Nolan's face, Victor turned and walked away, Howard matching his stride. That went well, Howard commented, though I'm not sure threatening them openly was wise. It wasn't a threat, Victor replied. Just a preview. Chapter 5, Count to Moves. By the following week, Diana's carefully constructed world was crumbling. The gallery's reputation took a significant hit when rumors of authentication problems spread through the art community. Major clients quietly distanced themselves. Her credit cards, previously paid from joint accounts, now frozen to her, were declined at a high-end restaurant where she was dining with potential investors. Nolan, meanwhile, received an official letter from the FBI requesting interviews about the provenance of several artworks he had sourced internationally. His normally smooth confidence gave way to increasing panic. We need to separate our situations, he told Diana during a tense dinner at his apartment. My attorney says I should distance myself from the gallery operations while this investigation is ongoing. Diana stared at him in disbelief. Distance yourself? This was your idea. You assured me these pieces were legitimate. Lower your voice, Nolan hissed. I never guaranteed anything. The art market has always operated in gray areas. You knew that. I knew nothing of the sort. You told me these were incredible finds from private European collections. Nolan's expression hardened. Your naivete isn't my problem. I'm trying to protect both of us. By throwing me under the bus? Diana's voice rose despite his warning. Everything is falling apart, and you're already planning your exit? Don't be dramatic, Nolan said dismissively. We just need to be strategic. Victor's clearly been planning this for months. We need to be equally careful. Diana grabbed her purse and stood. I trusted you. I left my marriage for you. You left your marriage for half of Victor's money, Nolan corrected her coldly. Don't pretend this was some great romance. We both saw an opportunity. Diana slapped him hard across the face, then stormed out. Alone in her car, she finally allowed the tears to come. Everything was collapsing around her. The gallery she'd built, her reputation, her financial security, and now even her relationship with Nolan. For the first time, she considered that she might have catastrophically misjudged Victor Sullivan. The next morning, against Valerie's explicit advice, Diana drove to Victor's office, determined to speak with him directly. His assistant, Pamela, regarded her with undisguised contempt but buzzed Victor nonetheless. To Diana's surprise, he agreed to see her. Victor's office remained, as she remembered, meticulously organized, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he had helped build. He stood as she entered, his expression unreadable. You have 10 minutes, he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Diana had rehearsed a speech, part apology, part negotiation, but facing Victor now, words failed her. The gallery is failing, she finally said. My credit cards are maxed out. Nolan is. She trailed off, showing his true colors. Victor suggested, his tone almost conversational. Funny how quickly rats abandon a sinking ship. I made a mistake, Diana admitted, swallowing her pride. A terrible mistake. But destroying everything I've worked for won't fix anything. Victor leaned back in his chair. The gallery is failing because your lover supplied it with questionable artwork and because you've been embezzling from its accounts. Your credit cards are maxed out because you've been living beyond your means without my income to support you. These are consequences, Diana, not punishment. What do you want? She asked desperately. To humiliate me? To watch me lose everything? What I want, Victor said quietly, is for you to experience exactly what you planned for me. To lose what you've built, to be betrayed by someone you trusted, to realize how completely you misjudged a situation. He checked his watch. Your 10 minutes are up. Diana remained seated. I'll drop the divorce proceedings. We can work through this. Victor's laugh held no humor. You still don't understand. I don't want reconciliation. I want you to face the natural consequences of your choices. As security escorted a sobbing Diana from the building, Victor turned his attention back to his computer screen, where he was reviewing updates from Max about Nolan's increasingly desperate attempts to distance himself from the questionable art transactions. That afternoon, Diana received notice that the gallery's landlord was terminating their lease due to concerns about illegal activities that might violate their contract. The building's insurance company had apparently received anonymous information about authentication issues with the gallery's inventory. Simultaneously, the bank holding the gallery's business loans initiated a review based on financial irregularities, freezing remaining operating funds. Without inventory, location, or operating capital, Diana's business effectively ceased to exist overnight. When she called Nolan, desperate for support or at least consolation, his number had been disconnected. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The art world thrives on scandal nearly as much as it does on authenticity. By the time the Montana Arts Journal published its exposé on questionable practices at Diana Sullivan's gallery, featuring interviews with former employees and clients, Diana had become a pariah in the community she had once navigated so confidently. The article stopped short of outright accusations, but raised enough questions about both Diana's business practices and Nolan's authentication methods to ensure neither would work in fine art again without significant rehabilitation. What the article didn't mention, because no one had made the connection yet, was how precisely the gallery's collapse mirrored a failed development that had nearly bankrupted Victor 15 years earlier. Back then, Victor had trusted a business partner who, like Diana, had seen him as merely a stepping stone. That partner had manipulated financial records, diverted investors, and nearly destroyed everything Victor had built. Instead of breaking him, that betrayal had taught Victor his most valuable lesson. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford in business or, as it turned out, in marriage. 2 months after the emergency hearing, Victor received an unexpected visitor at his office. Nolan Prescott, looking considerably less polished than when they'd last met, sat nervously in the reception area. You have 5 minutes, Victor told him, standing rather than inviting Nolan into his office. Use them wisely. Nolan licked his lips. I can give you Diana's journals. The real ones, not the fake abuse documentation. She recorded everything about her plan to take your money, about using me to help build a case. He lowered his voice. She even discussed finding ways to access your personal accounts before filing for divorce. Victor's expression didn't change. Why would you betray her now? The FBI is closing in on the art authentication issues, Nolan admitted. I need to make a deal. Diana was the one who knowingly sold questionable pieces. I can prove she knew the risks and proceeded anyway. So you're offering to throw Diana under the bus to save yourself? Victor observed. Just as she predicted you would. Nolan blinked in confusion. What? Diana came to see me weeks ago, Victor explained. She said you were planning to blame her for everything. It seemed she was right about one thing at least. She's lying, Nolan insisted. We were in this together, but she was the driving force. I have proof. Victor checked his watch. Your 5 minutes are up, Mr. Prescott. I suggest you take whatever proof you have for the FBI directly. I have no interest in becoming involved in your mutual betrayals. As Nolan was escorted out, Victor returned to his office and made a phone call. He took the bait, he told Max. Make sure the FBI gets an anonymous tip about those storage lockers in Prescott's name. What Victor knew, and Nolan didn't, was that Diana had indeed come to see him again, not to reconcile, but to offer up Nolan in exchange for financial clemency. Victor had declined her offer too, recognizing that the former lovers were now desperately trying to betray each other to save themselves. It was exactly the outcome Victor had anticipated when he'd first seen them kissing outside the hotel months ago. People who betrayed once would betray again when pressure was applied. His plan had simply been to ensure that pressure came from all directions simultaneously. The final divorce hearing was almost anticlimactic. With Diana's credibility destroyed and the prenuptial agreement now firmly upheld, the proceedings were brief. Diana received only what the prenup specified, a small cash settlement and her personal belongings, most of which had already been sold to cover living expenses. She sat alone on her side of the courtroom, Valerie having withdrawn as counsel weeks earlier when Diana could no longer pay her substantial fees. The confident, stylish woman who had once spat on Victor's shoes was gone, replaced by someone hollow-eyed and diminished. As the judge finalized the divorce, Diana caught Victor's eye across the courtroom, searching for some hint of the man she had married. She found nothing there but cold finality. Outside the courthouse, a reporter approached Victor. Mr. Sullivan, do you have any comment on the FBI's arrest of Nolan Prescott for art fraud and your ex-wife's possible involvement? No comment, Victor replied, walking toward his car, where Pamela waited with his schedule for the afternoon. Behind him, he heard Diana calling his name, her voice breaking. He didn't turn around. That chapter of his life was closed. Chapter 7, New Alliances. 6 months after the divorce, Victor stood on the balcony of his Tokyo hotel suite, watching the city lights flicker like stars fall into earth. Sullivan Construction had expanded internationally, with new projects breaking ground across Asia. The company's value had nearly doubled. His phone buzzed with a text from Audrey Keller, the brilliant architectural engineer he'd hired to oversee the Asian expansion. They had developed an easy professional rapport that had gradually extended into dinners that ran late into the evening, discussing not just business but art, philosophy, and their respective views on integrity. Tokyo Tower looks spectacular at night, Audrey had texted, along with a photo from her own hotel balcony 15 floors below his. Better with company, he replied, surprising himself with the invitation implicit in those words. While he waited for her response, Victor reviewed a news alert on his tablet. Nolan Prescott had been sentenced to 7 years for art fraud, with additional charges related to money laundering still pending. Diana's name appeared in the article as a former gallery owner who cooperated with investigators, though her cooperation had come too late to salvage either her reputation or her freedom. After testifying against Nolan, Diana had been charged with lesser financial crimes. She had accepted a plea deal, 3 years probation, significant fines she couldn't pay, and community service. The last Victor had heard, she was working as a clerk in a frame shop in a small Idaho town, about as far from the glamorous art world as one could get. Victor felt no satisfaction in these developments, only a cold certainty that justice had been served. He had not ruined Diana and Nolan. They had done that themselves. He had merely ensured their actions had consequences. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Audrey stood there, elegant in a simple black dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. I thought we might enjoy the view together, she said with a small smile. Later, as they shared wine on the balcony, Audrey asked the question most people were afraid to voice. The divorce, the gallery collapse, Prescott's arrest. Did you orchestrate all of it? Victor considered her for a long moment. I created pressure points, he finally said. What happened after that was the natural consequence of who they were. Audrey nodded, accepting this answer without judgment. My ex-husband cheated with my business partner. When I found out, I was so angry I could barely function. You seem so controlled. Anger is a luxury for people who lack patience, Victor replied. Revenge isn't about emotion. It's about strategy. Is that why you're here in Tokyo? Strategy? Victor looked out at the glittering cityscape. Partly, but also because life continues. Diana and Nolan were a chapter, not the whole story. Audrey touched his hand lightly. I like that philosophy. Too many people get stuck in their worst chapters. For the first time in over a year, Victor felt something like peace. Not happiness. He was too realistic to expect that so soon. But perhaps the potential for it, somewhere in the future. Back in Montana, construction began on Victor's newest project, a modern art center built on the site of Diana's failed gallery. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew their history, though Victor described it publicly as simply addressing a community need. Local artists were thrilled by the facility's plans for affordable studio space and mentoring programs for disadvantaged youth. Precisely the kind of community engagement Diana had always dismissed as unprofitable. Among the center's first hires was Lisa Harlow, Diana's younger sister, who had been estranged from Diana for years due to what Lisa described as Diana's self-centered approach to family. Lisa had reached out to Victor after the divorce, initially to apologize for her sister's behavior, and eventually to discuss her own ideas for community arts education. Are you sure you want me involved? Lisa had asked when Victor offered her the position of education director. People will talk. People always talk, Victor had replied. What matters is what we build. The Sullivan Arts Center broke ground on a crisp autumn morning, with local officials and arts community leaders gathered for the ceremony. Victor stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching as Lisa eloquently described the center's mission to reporters. His phone buzzed with a text from Howard. Nolan Prescott requesting meeting. Claims to have important information. Advised against but thought you should know. Victor deleted the message without responding. Whatever game Prescott was playing from prison held no interest for him. That story was finished. Chapter 8. Unexpected Return. On the first anniversary of his divorce, Victor returned home from a business trip to find Pamela looking unusually concerned. Mr. Sullivan, there's someone waiting in your office. She insisted it was urgent and personal. Victor raised an eyebrow. She, Tessa Harlow, Pamela said. She says she's your former sister-in-law. Victor frowned. Diana had never mentioned another sister besides Lisa. Call security to stand by, he instructed, then headed to his office. The woman who rose from the visitor's chair was strikingly similar to Diana in coloring, but different in every other way. Where Diana had been polished and perfect, this woman had a natural, almost wild quality about her. Mr. Sullivan, she said, extending her hand. I apologize for the intrusion. I'm Tessa Harlow, Diana's half-sister. We've never met because I've been overseas for most of my adult life. Victor shook her hand, but remained standing. What can I do for you, Ms. Harlow? It's actually what I can do for you, Tessa replied, opening her bag and removing a thick manila envelope. Diana sent me these from Idaho with instructions to deliver them to you directly. Victor made no move to take the envelope. Whatever game Diana is playing now, I'm not interested. Tessa placed the envelope on his desk. I understand your reluctance. Diana and I have never been close, different mothers, different values. But she insisted these documents were important to you personally. She stepped back. My obligation ends with delivery. What you do with them is your business. After Tessa left, Victor stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally opening it. Inside were documents he immediately recognized. Ownership certificates for the 3 questionable Degas pieces from Diana's gallery. But these weren't the certificates Nolan had provided. These were authentic verification documents showing the pieces were legitimate, apparently suppressed by Nolan to artificially inflate their value through rarity. Along with the certificates was a handwritten note from Diana. Victor, these won't repair what I destroyed, but they might help you understand what really happened. Nolan convinced me the art world required strategic ambiguity to maximize profits. I was foolish and greedy enough to believe him. The paintings are real. The FBI investigation was based on falsified evidence. some of which I believe you might have provided. If you're reading this, you've won completely. I hope it brought you peace. Diana. Victor set the documents aside, unsure what to make of this development. If Diana was telling the truth, and the documentation appeared genuine, then part of Nolan's conviction had been based on incorrect evidence. Victor had assumed the art fraud allegations were legitimate, focusing his efforts only on ensuring they came to light. The thought that he might have inadvertently facilitated false charges was uncomfortable. Victor Sullivan played hardball, but he had always prided himself on operating within ethical boundaries, even when seeking justice. He called Howard. I need you to verify some documents, and I need everything we have on the Degas authentication evidence. After a thorough investigation revealed Diana was telling the truth about the artwork, Victor faced a difficult decision. Correcting the record would help Nolan Prescott, a man who had still committed other financial crimes. Remaining silent would mean being complicit in a false conviction. Victor ultimately chose integrity over vengeance. He anonymously submitted the authentic certificates to the FBI with an explanation of their provenance. He made no effort to assist Prescott beyond ensuring the truth was available to authorities. The revelation did reduce some of Nolan's charges, though his sentence was only marginally affected due to the other financial crimes he had genuinely committed. More significantly, it created a public narrative that somewhat rehabilitated Diana's professional reputation, acknowledging that she had been manipulated by Nolan regarding the authenticity issues. When the news broke, Lisa confronted Victor in his office. Did you know about this? That the art was real? No, Victor said truthfully. I assumed Prescott's entire operation was fraudulent. Lisa studied his face. And now that you know it wasn't, at least not entirely, do you regret what happened to Diana? Victor considered the question carefully. I regret that she made choices that destroyed what could have been a good life. I regret that she valued money and excitement over integrity and commitment. But I don't regret ensuring that those choices had consequences. Lisa nodded slowly. You know, growing up with Diana was difficult. She always got what she wanted, usually at someone else's expense. You're probably the first person who ever truly held her accountable. That wasn't my goal, Victor said. I simply refused to be her victim. Later that week, Victor received another envelope. This one from his investigator. Max inside was a surveillance photo of Diana in Idaho, looking thin but composed, leaving the frame shop where she worked. The accompanying note read, "Thought you should know. She's been sober 6 months. Working 2 jobs to pay restitution. Locals say she volunteers teaching art to kids on weekends." Victor placed the photo in his desk drawer without comment. Diana's redemption arc, if that's what it was, had no bearing on his life now. She had made her choices, and he had made his. Chapter 9. The Final Calculation. 2 years after the divorce, Victor stood at the podium during the grand opening of the Sullivan Arts Center, delivering brief remarks to the assembled crowd of local dignitaries and arts patrons. This center represents my belief that communities thrive when creativity has room to flourish, he concluded. Thank you to everyone who helped make this vision a reality, especially our dedicated education director, Lisa Harlow. As applause filled the modern gallery space, Victor's gaze caught on a familiar figure at the back of the crowd, Tessa Harlow, watching him with an unreadable expression. She nodded once in acknowledgement before slipping out a side door. Later, as guests mingled during the reception, Victor found himself momentarily alone in the main gallery. Audrey had flown in for the opening, but was currently engaged in conversation with the center's architect across the room. Their relationship had developed gradually into something meaningful, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Quite an achievement, a voice said behind him. Victor turned to find Tessa holding 2 champagne flutes. She offered one to him, which he accepted with a nod. Diana saw the write-up in the Idaho paper, Tessa said without preamble. The Arts Center built where a gallery once stood. She called it poetic justice. How is she? Victor asked, surprising himself with the question. Surviving, Tessa replied. Sober. Working. Trying to make amends where possible. She studied him. She asked me to deliver a message, though I told her you probably wouldn't want to hear it. And yet here you are, Victor observed. Family obligation, Tessa said with a slight shrug. She wanted you to know that she understands now what she threw away, what she destroyed. Not just the marriage, but her integrity. She said to tell you that you were right about everything, especially Nolan. Victor took a sip of champagne. Is that supposed to matter to me now? I don't think so, Tessa said honestly. Diana always believed her feelings should matter more to others than they actually do. I think this message is more for her benefit than yours. Part of her making amends to herself. Victor nodded, appreciating Tessa's directness. Thank you for delivering it. Tessa finished her champagne. There's one more thing, something I wanted to ask personally. The FBI agent who investigated Nolan told Diana that the evidence against him arrived from multiple anonymous sources, perfectly organized to build a comprehensive case. He said in 20 years, he'd never seen such methodical documentation of financial crimes. Interesting, Victor said non-committally. Diana believes you orchestrated everything. Not just her downfall, but Nolan's complete destruction. She thinks you mapped out every move months in advance, like some kind of chess grandmaster. Diana always did have an active imagination, Victor remarked. Tessa laughed softly. That's what I told her. No one could be that calculating, that patient. She set down her empty glass. But watching you tonight, seeing all this. She gestured around the gallery. I'm not so sure she was wrong. Victor smiled slightly. Life rarely offers perfect justice, Ms. Harlow. Sometimes we have to design it ourselves. As Tessa left, Audrey appeared at Victor's side. Everything okay? You looked intense. Just tying up loose ends, Victor replied, taking her hand. Nothing important. That night, after the successful opening, Victor sat alone in his home office reviewing plans for his next major project, a development that would transform an abandoned industrial district into affordable housing and small business spaces. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Congratulations on the center. You've built something meaningful from the ashes. D. Victor deleted the message without responding. Diana Sullivan belonged to his past, and he had no interest in bridging that gap. The woman who had once been his wife had made her choices, and he had ensured those choices had permanent consequences. That chapter was closed forever. As he turned back to his work, Victor reflected on the path that had led him here. He had not sought revenge in the traditional sense, hot-blooded, emotional, destructive. Instead, he had methodically ensured that justice was served, that betrayal carried appropriate costs, and that he emerged not just intact, but stronger. In the end, Victor Sullivan had not just survived betrayal. He had alchemized it into success, turning his enemies' weapons against them with a precision they never saw coming until it was too late. The empire they had tried to steal from him had only grown more substantial, and the man they had underestimated had revealed himself to be exactly what he had always been. Someone who would never forgive a betrayal, never forget a lesson, and never leave a debt unpaid. It was not forgiveness that had freed him, but the perfect execution of justice on his own terms. And in that execution, he had found, if not happiness, then something perhaps more valuable. Peace on his own terms, with no compromises and no loose ends. Victor closed his laptop and looked out at the Montana night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new victories. The past was settled. The future belonged entirely to him. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Family Dynamics. Simon Fitzgerald adjusted his tie as he walked through the marble lobby of the Meridian Hotel, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with practiced confidence. At 35, he had the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp green eyes that missed nothing. His wife, Angela, walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, though he could feel the tension in her grip. Promise me you won't let him get to you tonight, Angela whispered as they approached the elevator. Her auburn hair was pulled back elegantly, highlighting the worry lines that had become more pronounced over the past few months. Simon pressed the button for the 20th floor, his jaw tightening slightly. When have I ever let Chad get to me? Angela gave him a look that said every time, but she didn't voice it. They both knew tonight's dinner was going to be another test of Simon's patience. Her brother Chad had been pushing boundaries for years, ever since Simon had started making real money in the restaurant business. What had begun as harmless sibling rivalry had evolved into something more sinister, a calculated campaign to undermine Simon at every family gathering. The elevator opened to reveal Chad Wilder already waiting, his arms crossed and a smirk playing on his lips. At 32, Chad had the kind of good looks that had gotten him by for most of his life. Sandy brown hair, bright blue eyes, and a charm that fooled most people until they got to know him better. His wife Rita stood behind him, scrolling through her phone with practiced disinterest. Well, if it isn't the golden couple, Chad said, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm. Ready to celebrate my promotion? Simon extended his hand, which Chad gripped a little too tightly. Congratulations. Regional sales manager, right? That's right. Finally caught up to someone making real money. Chad's eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite humor. Though I suppose you wouldn't know what it's like to actually work for your success. Angela stiffened beside Simon, but he simply smiled. Hard work comes in many forms, Chad. Rita looked up from her phone long enough to add, some people just get lucky, I guess. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Simon had heard variations of this theme for 3 years now, ever since his restaurant empire had started taking off. To Chad and Rita, his success was either luck, inheritance, or somehow unearned. They refused to acknowledge the 18-hour days, the failed ventures, the years of learning every aspect of the hospitality business from the ground up. As they walked toward the restaurant, Chad continued his verbal prodding. So, Simon, still playing with your little food trucks? Or have you moved on to actual restaurants yet? Simon's empire currently included 12 establishments across 3 states, from high-end steakhouses to innovative fusion concepts. His flagship restaurant had been featured in Food and Wine magazine just last month. But Chad had a talent for reducing everything Simon had built to little food trucks or cute cafe experiments. Business is good, Simon replied evenly. I bet it is. Amazing what you can accomplish when you don't have to answer to anyone. Chad's tone suggested that Simon's entrepreneurial success was somehow less legitimate than his corporate job. Angela squeezed Simon's arm harder, and he could practically hear her thoughts. Don't take the bait. Not tonight. They reached Le Bernardin, one of the city's most exclusive French restaurants. The hostess, a statuesque blonde named Christine Potter, greeted them with professional warmth. As she led them to their table, Chad made a show of looking around. Fancy place, he said loudly enough for nearby diners to hear. Hope the food's worth the prices. Though I suppose money's no object when you're not really earning it yourself. Simon felt Angela's fingernails dig into his arm through his jacket. He'd learned to read his wife's signals over their 8 years of marriage. She was reaching her breaking point with her brother's behavior, but family loyalty ran deep with the Wilders. Angela had been protecting Chad since they were children, covering for his mistakes, making excuses for his failures, absorbing the collateral damage of his selfishness. The pattern was always the same. Chad would push until someone snapped, then play the victim when consequences arrived. He'd perfected the art of walking right up to the line without technically crossing it, leaving his targets looking like the aggressors if they responded. As they settled into their seats, Chad continued his performance. So Rita and I have been talking about getting into the restaurant business ourselves. How hard could it be, right? Buy some ingredients, hire some cooks, collect the profits. Simon opened his menu calmly. There's definitely more to it than that. Come on, don't be modest. It's basically just customer service with food involved. I've been handling difficult clients for years. Restaurant customers can't be that much harder. Rita nodded along enthusiastically. We've been thinking about starting with a nice steakhouse. Those seem to do well. Simon could have explained the complexities of food cost management, staffing challenges, health department regulations, supply chain logistics, and the razor-thin profit margins that destroyed 90% of new restaurants within their first year. Instead, he simply said, "Good luck with that." Chad's eyes narrowed slightly at the dismissive response. He'd been hoping to draw Simon into a detailed explanation that he could then pick apart and minimize. When that didn't work, he shifted tactics. "Of course, it helps to have connections. Angela mentioned you know some people in the industry." This was dangerous territory. Simon did indeed have connections: investors, suppliers, real estate developers, city officials. But they've been earned through years of building relationships and proving himself. Chad's implication was that these relationships were the secret to Simon's success, not his skill or dedication. "Networking is important in any business," Simon acknowledged. Right. It's all about who you know." Chad leaned back in his chair with satisfaction, as if he'd just solved a puzzle. "That explains a lot." Angela finally spoke up. "Simon built his first restaurant from scratch, Chad. He worked 16-hour days for 2 years straight." "I'm sure he did," Chad replied smoothly. "I'm not saying it wasn't work. I'm just saying some people have advantages others don't." The waiter arrived to take their drink orders, providing a momentary reprieve from the tension. Chad ordered an expensive bottle of wine, the good stuff since we're celebrating, while Simon requested a club soda with lime. He'd learned years ago to stay sharp around Chad. As they waited for their drinks, Chad launched into a story about his promotion, making sure to emphasize how much his new position would pay and how impressed his bosses had been with his performance. It was classic Chad, turning a conversation that should have been about celebration into a competition. The crazy thing is, they offered the promotion to 2 other people first, but they both turned it down, Chad said, apparently oblivious to how this undermined his narrative of being specially chosen. "Can you believe that? Turning down this kind of opportunity?" Simon nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd been watching Chad's behavior patterns for years, documenting the small cruelties and calculated insults. Tonight felt different, though. There was an edge to Chad's performance, a recklessness that suggested he was building towards something bigger. The drinks arrived, and Chad made a show of tasting the wine before approving it. As the waiter poured glasses for everyone, Chad raised his in a toast. "To family," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, "and to finally being able to afford the finer things in life." The implication was clear. Unlike Simon, Chad had earned his money through legitimate means. As they clinked glasses, Simon caught Angela's eye and saw the mixture of embarrassment and resignation there. She'd been hoping tonight would be different, that maybe Chad had matured enough to celebrate without tearing others down. But Simon knew better. Chad was just getting started. Chapter 2. The Escalation. The appetizer course arrived with ceremonious flair, delicate arrangements of seared foie gras that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Chad made a show of photographing his plate from multiple angles, clearly planning to post about the expensive meal on social media. "This is incredible," Rita gushed, taking a bite. "We should definitely come here more often now that we can afford it." "Absolutely," Chad agreed. "It's nice to finally be at a level where money isn't a constant worry. I can't imagine what it's like for people who have to stress about every dollar." Simon recognized the trap. Chad was trying to bait him into either agreeing, which would make him seem out of touch, or disagreeing, which would open the door for Chad to attack his background. Growing up, the Fitzgerald family had struggled financially after Simon's father died when he was 15. Simon had worked his way through college, started his first business with a $5,000 loan from his mother's life insurance, and built everything from there. "Everyone has different challenges," Simon said diplomatically. Chad's eyes lit up like he'd been given an opening. "That's so true. Like, I was just telling Rita how lucky you were to get into restaurants when you did. Right place, right time, you know? The food scene really exploded just as you were getting started." Angela set down her fork a little too hard. "Simon didn't get lucky, Chad. He researched market trends for months before opening his first place." "Oh, I know. I'm not saying he didn't work hard. I'm just saying timing is everything." Chad leaned forward conspiratorially. "Plus, being single when you started must have been such an advantage. No family responsibilities, no one depending on you. You could take all kinds of risks that married guys like me couldn't afford to take." The comment was perfectly crafted poison. Chad knew that Simon had actually been engaged during those early years to his college girlfriend who'd left him when the restaurant business consumed his life. He'd sacrificed that relationship and many others building his empire. But Chad was rewriting history to make Simon's success seem like the result of irresponsibility rather than sacrifice. Rita nodded enthusiastically. That's so smart. Get established first, then worry about relationships later. Very strategic. Simon felt Angela's leg brush against his under the table, her way of reminding him to stay calm. But something was building inside him, a cold anger that he'd been suppressing for years. Different people make different choices at different times, he said evenly. Exactly, Chad exclaimed. And you made all the right ones. No judgment here. I actually admire the ruthless focus. Not everyone can prioritize business over everything else the way you did. The word ruthless hung in the air like an accusation. Chad was painting Simon as someone who'd trampled over relationships and responsibilities to get ahead, someone who'd chosen money over human connection. Their main courses arrived. Chad had ordered the most expensive item on the menu, a Japanese A5 Wagyu steak that cost nearly $200. He made a show of cutting into it, closing his eyes in exaggerated bliss as he tasted it. My God, this is incredible. Rita, you have to try this. He held out a piece on his fork, feeding her like they were at a romantic dinner rather than a family meal. Simon noticed the performance was attracting attention from nearby tables. Chad loved an audience, and he'd spotted an elderly couple at the next table watching their interaction with interest. You know what's funny? Chad continued, raising his voice slightly. I always thought expensive food was just marketing, but this actually tastes different. I guess when you're spending real money, you get real quality. The implication was clear. Simon's restaurants were somehow fake or inferior, marketing over substance. It was particularly cutting because Simon had built his reputation on sourcing the finest ingredients and developing innovative techniques. The best restaurants focus on quality at every price point, Simon replied. Oh, absolutely. I'm not criticizing. It's just interesting how different markets work. Like, I'm sure your places serve great food for their target demographic. Their target demographic. Chad was suggesting that Simon's restaurants were somehow downmarket, that he didn't operate at the same level as establishments like this one. Angela had stopped eating entirely, her knuckles white as she gripped her wine glass. Simon could practically see her internal debate, stay loyal to her brother or defend her husband. It was a position Chad had put her in countless times over the years. Simon's restaurants have won multiple awards, she said quietly. And they should. Awards are great for business. Chad's tone suggested that awards were participation trophies rather than recognition of actual excellence. The conversation continued through the main course, with Chad finding new ways to diminish Simon's accomplishments while appearing supportive. He questioned whether Simon's restaurants could survive a recession, wondered aloud about the stress of depending on food trends, and suggested that the restaurant business was probably harder now that everyone and their brother was trying to get into it. Each comment was like a paper cut, individually small but collectively devastating. Simon found himself having to defend his entire career and identity, while Chad positioned himself as the voice of practical wisdom. By the time dessert arrived, Simon had cataloged dozens of microaggressions, each one carefully crafted to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Chad had turned what should have been a celebration into a systematic deconstruction of Simon's self-worth. But the worst was yet to come. As the waiter presented the dessert menu, Chad waved it away dramatically. Actually, I think we should order something really special to cap off this amazing meal. What's the most expensive dessert you have? The waiter, a young man named Timothy Sherwood, looked slightly uncomfortable. Well, sir, our chocolate souffle with gold leaf is quite popular, or we have the vintage wine tasting with paired chocolates. Perfect. Let's do both. And how about some champagne to go with it? Something really nice. This is a celebration, after all. Simon watched Chad's performance with growing understanding. This wasn't just about showing off anymore. Chad was running up a massive bill, something that would normally make Simon uncomfortable given his practical nature. But why would Chad care about making Simon uncomfortable with an expensive meal unless? The realization hit him like a cold wave. Chad was setting up something bigger. This whole evening, the expensive wine, the premium steaks, the elaborate desserts, it was all building toward a moment when the bill would arrive and Chad would spring his trap. Simon's mind raced through the possibilities. Chad could claim he'd forgotten his wallet, putting Simon in the position of having to pay or causing a scene. He could suggest they split the bill equally, knowing he'd ordered far more than anyone else. He could make a show of calculating tips and taxes, revealing how little Simon was willing to spend on service. Whatever Chad had planned, it would be designed to publicly humiliate Simon while making Chad look like the victim of Simon's stinginess or selfishness. Simon felt a strange calm descend over him. For years, he'd endured Chad's psychological warfare because Angela loved her brother and because family harmony seemed more important than his own dignity. But tonight was different. Tonight, Chad was planning something that would cross every line. "You know what?" Simon said, pulling out his phone. "I should probably check in with my managers. Make sure everything's running smoothly." "Always working," Chad said with mock sympathy. "That's the price of success, I guess. No rest for the entrepreneur." Simon scrolled through his contacts, finding the number he needed. As Chad continued his monologue about work-life balance, Simon typed a quick message. "Dave, it's Simon. I'm at Luke Bernardine tonight. Table 32. Just wanted to give you a heads up." The response came back almost immediately. "Got it, boss. Anything specific you need?" Simon smiled as he typed back. "Just be yourself. And thanks for covering for me tonight." He put his phone away and focused on Chad, who was now telling Rita about his plans to redecorate their apartment with his promotion bonus. The irony wasn't lost on Simon. Chad was spending money he didn't even have yet while positioning himself as more fiscally responsible than someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar business. "I've always believed in celebrating victories," Chad was saying. "Life's too short to worry about every penny." The champagne arrived, along with the elaborate desserts. Chad made another toast, this one to living life to the fullest, while shooting meaningful glances at Simon. The bill was growing by the minute, and Simon could practically see Chad mentally calculating the impact. What Chad didn't know was that Simon had spent the last 5 minutes setting a trap of his own, one that would turn Chad's planned humiliation into something very different. As they finished their champagne, Chad checked his watch theatrically. "Wow, time flies when you're having fun. We should probably think about wrapping this up soon." Simon nodded agreeably, knowing that Chad's moment was approaching. Years of psychological warfare were about to come to a head, and for the first time in their relationship, Simon was going to be ready. The waiter approached with a leather folder, and Chad's eyes gleamed with anticipation. This was it, the moment he'd been building toward all evening. "Check, please," Chad said with a smile that didn't quite hide his excitement. Simon sat back and waited, knowing that everything was about to change. Chapter 3. The Revelation. The bill arrived with the quiet ceremony of a funeral dirge. Timothy, the waiter, placed the leather folder directly in the center of the table, equidistant from all 4 diners, a diplomatic choice that would soon prove irrelevant. Chad's hand moved toward the folder with theatrical reluctance, like a man burdened by responsibility. "Well, I suppose someone has to look at the damage," he said with a laugh that sounded slightly forced. Simon watched Chad's eyes scan the total, saw the barely concealed satisfaction flash across his features. The bill was substantial, over $800 for their party of 4, thanks to the premium wine, the Wagyu steaks, and the elaborate dessert Chad had insisted on ordering. "Jesus," Chad whistled, making sure his voice carried to the neighboring tables. "I knew this place was expensive, but wow, $837. He looked around the table with mock concern. "I mean, it was absolutely worth it, but that's more than some people make in a week." Rita leaned over to peer at the bill, her eyes widening appropriately. "That's more than our rent," she said, not quite whispering. Angela shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Simon could feel her tension radiating across the small table. She knew her brother well enough to sense something coming, but she couldn't quite figure out what. Chad closed the folder with a dramatic sigh, then began patting his jacket pockets with increasing urgency. His expression shifted from casual confidence to puzzled concern, then to barely concealed panic. "Oh no," he muttered, checking his pants pockets. "Oh no, no, no. What's wrong?" Angela asked, though Simon suspected she already knew. Chad's performance reached its crescendo as he frantically searched his wallet, pulling out credit cards and examining them like foreign artifacts. "I can't believe this. My credit card, it's my work card. I completely forgot they deactivated it when I switched departments. The new one won't arrive until Monday." Rita joined the performance, checking her own purse with exaggerated thoroughness. "I don't have my card either. It's at home in my other purse." The young couple at the next table had stopped pretending not to listen, openly staring at the unfolding drama. Chad seemed to notice their attention and leaned into it, his voice carrying just enough to ensure an audience. "This is so embarrassing," he said, his face flushing with what Simon recognized as manufactured shame. "I invited everyone to celebrate my promotion, and now—" He trailed off, looking helplessly around the table. Then his eyes landed on Simon, and his expression shifted to something that was supposed to look like reluctant hope. "Simon, I hate to ask this, but could you spot me? I'll pay you back first thing Monday, I promise." With interest, the trap was finally sprung. Chad had orchestrated this entire evening to put Simon in an impossible position. If Simon paid without complaint, Chad could claim later that Simon was showing off his wealth, flaunting his success over family. If Simon hesitated or complained about the amount, Chad could paint him as petty and cheap, someone who nickel and dimed his own family. But Chad's masterstroke was the public nature of the moment. The elderly couple at the next table, the waitstaff, even other diners within earshot were all witnesses to Simon's response. Whatever he did would be remembered and potentially retold, becoming part of Chad's narrative about their relationship. "Looks like you're washing dishes tonight," Chad added with a laugh that sounded hollow to Simon's trained ear. Angela looked mortified, caught between loyalty to her brother and embarrassment at his behavior. Rita was trying to look sympathetic while clearly enjoying the drama. The waiter stood at a respectful distance, professionally neutral but obviously uncomfortable with the situation. Simon reached into his jacket and withdrew a black American Express Centurion card, placing on the table with the same casual precision he'd used to set down a glass of water. Chad's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the legendary black card, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Wow, fancy. I should have figured you'd have one of those." The comment was perfectly calibrated, acknowledging the card's prestige while implying that Simon was showing off. Chad was already preparing his narrative for later. Simon made such a big deal about paying, waving around his black card like some kind of trophy. Timothy, the waiter, picked up the card with practiced reverence. But as he examined it, something strange happened. His professional composure cracked slightly, and he looked at Simon with sudden recognition. "Mr. Fitzgerald," he said quietly, "I'll be right back with this." Chad caught the change in the waiter's tone immediately. His eyes narrowed as he studied Simon's face, looking for some clue about what had just happened. "He knows you," Chad said, his voice carefully neutral. "Do you eat here often?" "Occasionally," Simon replied, which was technically true. He'd been here 3 times in the past year for business meetings. But Timothy was already walking quickly toward the kitchen, and Simon could see him speaking urgently to someone through the service window. Within moments, a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit was walking toward their table with purposeful strides. Dave Miller was the general manager of Loop Bernardine, a consummate professional with 20 years of experience in high-end hospitality. But more importantly to Simon, Dave was also the general manager of Simon's flagship restaurant, the Meridian Room, which he ran under a management contract that allowed him to oversee multiple establishments. Dave approached their table with a warm smile directed specifically at Simon. "Mr. Fitzgerald, what a pleasant surprise. I didn't realize you were dining with us tonight." Chad's confusion was visible, but he quickly masked it with his practiced charm. "Oh, are you the manager? The service has been absolutely incredible tonight." Dave acknowledged Chad with a polite nod before turning back to Simon. "Sir, I wanted to personally ensure everything has been to your satisfaction this evening." "Everything's been perfect, Dave. Please thank the chef for the excellent preparation." I certainly will. Dave gestured slightly toward the bill. And, of course, there's no charge for tonight. The owner's instructions were very clear about that. The words hung in the air like a revelation. Chad's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, realization, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as the implications sank in. The owner? Chad's voice came out slightly strangled. Dave looked genuinely surprised by the question. Mr. Fitzgerald owns Loop Bernardine, along with several other establishments in the city. I manage this location for him, just as I manage the Meridian Room. The silence that followed was deafening. Chad's carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time as his brain processed what he'd just learned. For months, he'd been positioning himself as Simon's equal, suggesting that Simon's success was somehow less legitimate than his own corporate job. He'd spent the entire evening talking about finally being able to afford the finer things while unknowingly dining as Simon's guest in Simon's own restaurant. Rita's face had gone pale. The elderly couple at the next table were now staring openly, having witnessed what was clearly a significant moment. Timothy, the waiter, stood nearby, uncertain whether to retreat or stay. Angela was looking at her husband with a mixture of shock and something that might have been pride. She'd known Simon was successful, but she hadn't realized the full extent of his holdings. He'd never mentioned owning Lou Bernardine, one of the city's most prestigious establishments. Chad's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he struggled to process the reversal. Every comment he'd made about expensive food, about real quality, about understanding fine dining had been unwittingly directed at the owner of the establishment. He'd spent the evening educating Simon about his own business. Chad started, then stopped, unable to complete the thought. Simon finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden hush. I acquired Luke Bernardine 18 months ago. Dave has been managing it for me since then, along with 3 other locations. The words were simple, factual, delivered without malice or triumph. But their impact on Chad was devastating. Every assumption he'd made, every insult he'd crafted, every attempt to diminish Simon's achievements had just been revealed as fundamentally ignorant. Dave, sensing the tension but maintaining his professionalism, addressed Simon again. Is there anything else you need this evening, sir? Just the usual, Dave. And please add a 30% gratuity for Timothy. He's provided excellent service tonight. Dave nodded and retreated, taking Timothy with him and leaving the family alone with the wreckage of Chad's ambitions. The silence stretched on, broken only by the quiet conversations from other tables and the distant sounds of kitchen activity. Chad stared at the tablecloth, his face cycling through shades of red and white as the full scope of his humiliation sank in. Simon reached across the table and placed his hand gently on Angela's. Ready to go home? She nodded wordlessly, still processing everything that had just happened. As they stood to leave, Chad finally found his voice. Why didn't you tell us? Simon paused, looking down at his brother-in-law with something that might have been pity. You never asked. The 4 words contained multitudes, years of endured insults, months of patience, and a quiet dignity that Chad's behavior had never quite managed to shake. As they walked toward the exit, Simon could feel the weight of watching eyes from every table they passed. The story of what had just happened would spread through the city's social circles by morning, becoming legend before the week was out. But for now, Simon was content to walk beside his wife, feeling her hand squeeze his arm with new understanding and, perhaps for the first time in years, genuine admiration. Behind them, Chad and Rita sat frozen at the table, contemplating the ruins of an evening that was supposed to have been Chad's triumph. The revolution was complete, but Simon suspected it was only the beginning. Chapter 4: Aftermath and Revelations. The Uber ride home passed in silence, so thick it felt like a physical presence in the car. Angela stared out the window at the passing streetlights, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Simon could see her processing the evening's events, trying to reconcile the husband she thought she knew with the man who casually owned one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Chad and Rita had opted to take a separate car, claiming they needed to discuss some things. In reality, Chad had been too humiliated to share a ride with Simon, and Rita had been too stunned to object. When they reached their penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Angela finally broke the silence. "Luke Bernardine," she said, shaking her head as she kicked off her heels. "You own Luke Bernardine, and you never thought to mention it?" Simon loosened his tie, choosing his words carefully. "I've never kept my business dealings secret from you. You have access to all our financial records. That's not the same thing, and you know it." Angela poured herself a glass of wine from the bottle they kept in the kitchen. There's a difference between having access to information and being told important things directly. She was right, of course. Simon had always been private about his business acquisitions, treating them as routine transactions rather than life events worth discussing. It was a habit formed during his early years, when every deal was uncertain and celebrating too early often led to disappointment. "I should have told you," he admitted, sitting down at their kitchen island. "I just didn't think about it. Dave manages the place, the staff runs the operations. I'm mostly just the money behind it." Angela studied his face over her wine glass. "Just the money behind a $2 million restaurant purchase. Just casually owning one of the places we've always talked about going to for our anniversary." The irony wasn't lost on Simon. They discussed Luke Bernardine multiple times over the years, with Angela mentioning how she'd love to celebrate a special occasion there someday. He'd always agreed non-committally, never revealing that he could arrange a table with a single phone call. "How many others are there?" Angela asked. "How many restaurants do you actually own that I don't know about?" Simon pulled out his phone and opened a folder of documents. 17 currently. 3 more in development. 2 I'm looking to sell. The number hit Angela like a physical blow. 17? Simon, that's not a restaurant business. That's an empire. She wasn't wrong. Somewhere along the way, Simon's entrepreneurial success had evolved into something much larger than either of them had fully grasped. What had started as a single neighborhood bistro had grown into a network of establishments spanning multiple states and market segments. "It just happened gradually," Simon said, though even he could hear how inadequate the explanation sounded. "One opportunity led to another, and before you knew it, you were a millionaire several times over, and your wife was finding out by accident at a family dinner." Angela's voice carried a mixture of hurt and amazement. "Do you realize what this means? Do you understand what just happened back there?" Simon did understand, perhaps better than Angela realized. Chad's humiliation tonight wasn't just about a failed attempt at embarrassment. It was about the complete demolition of a carefully constructed identity. For months, Chad had positioned himself as Simon's equal, someone who'd finally achieved the same level of success through more legitimate means. But the revelation that Simon owned the very restaurant Chad had chosen to demonstrate his new affluence changed everything. It suggested that Simon's wealth operated on a scale Chad couldn't even comprehend, let alone compete with. Angela's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and winced. "Chad," Simon asked. "Rita, she wants to know if we can talk about what happened tomorrow." Angela showed in the message. "Can we all sit down and discuss tonight? I think there might have been some misunderstandings." Simon almost smiled at the phrasing. Chad was already trying to reframe the evening as a misunderstanding rather than a calculated attempt at humiliation that had backfired spectacularly. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Angela set her phone aside and looked at him with an expression he'd rarely seen before, a mixture of protectiveness and resolve. "I want to understand why my brother has been treating you like garbage for 3 years, and why you've been letting him get away with it." It was a fair question. Simon had endured Chad's psychological warfare with remarkable patience, absorbing insults and subtle digs that would have prompted most people to respond much more aggressively. But Angela had never understood the calculation behind his restraint. "Because fighting him would have hurt you," Simon said simply. "Every time Chad takes a shot at me, you're caught in the middle. If I respond, you have to choose between defending your husband and protecting your brother. I didn't want to put you in that position." Angela stared at him for a long moment. "So you just absorb it?" "For 3 years. I absorb it because I love you and because I knew eventually Chad would overreach. People like your brother always do. They can't help themselves. The truth was more complex than that, but Simon didn't want to burden Angela with his complete understanding of her brother's psychology. Chad was a narcissist with deep-seated insecurity issues, someone who needed to diminish others to feel good about himself. Simon had recognized the pattern early and had been waiting for Chad to make a mistake that would expose him completely. Tonight had been that mistake. Angela's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Chad himself. She looked at the screen, then at Simon. "Answer it," he said. "Let's hear what he has to say." She put the phone on speaker. Chad's voice filled their kitchen, tight with barely controlled emotions. "Angela, we need to talk. What happened tonight? That wasn't fair." "What wasn't fair about it?" Angela asked, her voice cooler than Simon had heard it in years. "Simon embarrassed me in public. He could have mentioned he owned the place before we got there, before I made a fool of myself." Simon felt a flash of anger at the deflection. Chad was trying to rewrite history again, making himself the victim of Simon's deception rather than acknowledging his own behavior. "Chad," Angela said slowly, "you spent the entire evening insulting Simon's business, his success, and his work ethic. You ordered the most expensive items on the menu and then pretended you couldn't pay for them. How exactly is Simon supposed to be the bad guy here?" "That's not what happened," Chad protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "I was just trying to celebrate my promotion. I didn't know my credit card wouldn't work." The lie was so transparent that Angela actually laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Chad, you spent 40 minutes building up to that moment. You practically choreographed it." Silence from Chad's end, then Rita's voice in the background, too muffled to make out clearly. "Look," Chad said finally, "maybe I got a little carried away with the celebration. But Simon's my family now, and family doesn't humiliate family in public." The audacity of the statement left Angela speechless. Chad had spent years humiliating Simon at every family gathering, but now that the tables were turned, he was invoking family loyalty as a shield. Simon leaned toward the phone. "Chad, you're absolutely right. Family shouldn't humiliate family in public. I'm glad we finally agree on that." Another silence, longer this time. Chad was smart enough to recognize the trap in Simon's words, but not skilled enough to navigate around it. "I think we should all take some time to cool off," Chad said finally. "Maybe meet for lunch next week and clear the air." "Maybe," Angela replied, but her tone suggested it wasn't likely. After she hung up, they sat in silence for several minutes. Simon could see Angela processing not just the evening's events, but years of family dynamics she was finally viewing from a new perspective. "He's been doing this for 3 years, she said finally. "Taking shots at you, making you look bad, trying to undermine you. And I just let it happen." "You were trying to keep the peace," Simon said. "That's not the same thing as letting it happen." "Yes, it is." Angela's voice was firm. "I chose the easy path every time. I told myself I was protecting family relationships, but really I was just avoiding conflict. And meanwhile, my brother was systematically attacking my husband." Simon reached across the counter and took her hand. "You weren't ready to see it before. People have to come to realizations in their own time." "Well, I'm ready to see it now." Angela squeezed his hand. "And I'm ready to do something about it." Simon felt a shift in the air, a sense that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. For years, Chad had been a source of tension between them, a problem that Angela couldn't quite acknowledge and Simon couldn't quite solve. But tonight had brought everything into focus. "What do you want to do?" Simon asked. Angela's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I want to show my brother exactly who he's been messing with, and I want to make sure he never forgets it." Simon looked at his wife with new appreciation. Angela had always been intelligent and capable, but she'd also been trapped by family loyalty and a desire to avoid confrontation. Now, for the first time, her protective instincts were aligned with her husband rather than her brother. Chad had no idea what was coming for him. Chapter 5. The counterattack begins. Simon's phone started buzzing at 6:47 a.m., barely 12 hours after the dinner that had changed everything. Dave Miller's name appeared on the screen, and Simon answered while Angela was still sleeping beside him. "Morning, boss. Sorry to call so early," but I figured you'd want to know. We've got a situation. Simon slipped out of bed and walked to the living room, already suspecting what Dave was about to tell him. Chad called the restaurant this morning, Dave continued. 3 times. He wanted to speak to the real owner because he was convinced there had been some kind of mistake last night. What did you tell him? The truth. That you own Lou Bernardine, that I manage it for you, and that his bill was comped per your standing instructions. Dave paused. He didn't take it well. Started yelling about fraud and deception. Threatened to call the Better Business Bureau. Simon pinched the bridge of his nose. Chad was escalating, which meant he was feeling cornered. People like Chad became most dangerous when their carefully constructed self-image was threatened. Anything else? Yeah. He also called the Meridian Room and 2 of your other places. Same conversation each time. The staff is rattled. They've never had to deal with someone claiming you were lying about owning your own restaurants. This was worse than Simon had anticipated. Chad wasn't just embarrassed. He was actively trying to undermine Simon's credibility with his own employees. The implications were serious. If word got out that someone was questioning Simon's ownership of his restaurants, it could affect investor confidence and business relationships. Dave, I need you to send me a full list of everyone Chad spoke with, what he said, and what our people told him. And put out a memo to all the managers. Anyone who gets calls like this should refer them directly to our legal department. Already handled on the memo. I'll have the full report to you by noon. Angela appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe and looking curious about the early morning call. Simon covered the phone. Chad's been calling the restaurants, trying to verify that I actually own them. Angela's expression darkened. He's doubling down, tripling down from the sound of it. Simon uncovered the phone. Dave, anything else I should know? One more thing. He also tried to get Timothy, our waiter from last night, to confirm that you'd somehow bribed me to play along with a fake story. Kid was pretty shaken up by it. Simon felt his anger crystallizing into something harder and more focused. Harassing his employees was a line Chad shouldn't have crossed. Is Timothy working today? He's on the dinner shift. You want to talk to him? Yeah. And Dave? Make sure he knows this isn't his fault and that his job is completely secure. If anyone give him grief about last night, they answer to me personally. After hanging up, Simon found Angela in the kitchen making coffee, her movements sharp with barely contained fury. What's the plan? She asked without preamble. For what? Don't play dumb with me, Simon Fitzgerald. I know that look. You're not just angry. You're calculating. Chad crossed a line by going after your employees, and now you're going to do something about it. She was right, of course. Simon had reached his limit of patience with Chad's behavior. The psychological warfare was one thing, but threatening his business and harassing his staff required a more direct response. I'm going to show Chad exactly what he's been playing with, Simon said. But I need to know you're completely on board. Once we start this, there's no going back. Your relationship with your brother will never be the same. Angela poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one, her eyes steady and determined. My brother spent 3 years trying to destroy my husband's reputation and self-worth. Then he tried to humiliate you in public, and when that backfired, he decided to attack your employees. I stopped caring about preserving our relationship the moment he crossed that line. Simon nodded, recognizing the steel in his wife's voice that had first attracted him to her years ago. Angela could be diplomatic when necessary, but when she finally decided to fight, she fought to win. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You made me look like a fool last night, and I don't forget things like that. Chad. Simon showed the message to Angela, who stared at it with disbelief. He's actually threatening you? After everything he did? Classic Chad. In his mind, I'm the aggressor because I didn't let him humiliate me successfully. Angela grabbed her own phone and started typing rapidly. Rita's been texting me all morning, wanting to work things out and asking why we can't all just move past this. She has no idea what Chad's been doing behind the scenes. Simon's phone rang again. This time it was Julius Carr, his attorney and longtime friend. Julius handled all the legal aspects of Simon's business empire, from contract negotiations to employment issues. Simon, I just got an interesting call from someone claiming to be your brother-in-law. He wanted to verify your ownership of several restaurants and seemed to think there might be some kind of fraud involved. Chad's been calling around all morning, Simon explained. He's having trouble accepting reality. Well, his reality is about to get a lot more complicated. I did some basic research on him after the call, and he's got some interesting vulnerabilities. Simon put the phone on speaker so Angela could hear. What kind of vulnerabilities? Employment law violations, for starters. The company he works for, Hendricks & Associates, has very strict policies about employee conduct and social media usage. Your brother-in-law has been posting some problematic content on LinkedIn and Facebook, including disparaging comments about competitors and inappropriate remarks about clients. Angela leaned forward with interest. What kind of remarks? The kind that could get him fired if they came to his employer's attention. There's also the matter of his expense reports. I found several instances where he's claimed business meals that were clearly personal in nature. Simon felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. How extensive is this? Extensive enough to end his career if properly documented and presented. The man's been sloppy, probably because he never thought anyone would look closely at his professional conduct. Why are you telling me this, Julius? Because he threatened you, Simon. The text message you forwarded to me constitutes harassment, and given his pattern of behavior, I think we need to be prepared for him to escalate further. People like Chad don't usually stop at phone calls and text messages. Angela was staring at Simon with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The conversation had moved beyond family drama into something more serious. A systematic dismantling of Chad's professional life. What are you recommending? Simon asked. Document everything. His harassment of your employees, the threatening messages, the attempts to damage your business reputation. If he keeps pushing, we'll have multiple avenues for response. After Julius hung up, Angela sat back in her chair and looked at Simon with new understanding. This isn't just about getting back at Chad anymore, is it? This is about protecting your business. It's about both, Simon replied. Chad made it personal when he attacked me in front of you. He made it business when he went after my employees. Now he's made it legal with the threatening messages. Angela nodded slowly. So what's the next move? Simon's smile was cold and calculating. We're going to give Chad exactly what he's been asking for, a real competition with me. But we're going to play by my rules this time. Angela raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. To finally taking the gloves off. To finally taking the gloves off, Simon agreed. Neither of them noticed the text notification that popped up on Angela's phone. Meeting today at 2 p.m. Hendricks & Associates conference room. We need to discuss Chad's recent behavior. Rita, the battle was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 6. The trap is set. Angela stared at Rita's text message, reading it 3 times before the full implications sank in. Simon, you need to see this. He looked over her shoulder at the phone screen, his expression sharpening as he processed the message. They're having a meeting about Chad's behavior? At his company. That's what it sounds like. Angela scrolled through her earlier messages from Rita. She's been trying to do damage control all morning, but this suggests something bigger is happening. Simon's phone rang almost immediately. Dave Miller again. Boss, I've got an update on the Chad situation. It's more interesting than we thought. Go ahead. Turns out Chad didn't just call our restaurants this morning. He also called 3 of your competitors, trying to verify whether you actually own Le Bernardin. Apparently, he was hoping to catch you in a lie. Angela watched her husband's face transform as Dave continued speaking. Simon's expression went from mild interest to focused intensity, the look he got when he spotted a business opportunity or identified a threat that needed handling. Which competitors? Simon asked. Russo's Patterson Holdings and Fitzgerald Group. No relation to you, just coincidental name. Here's the interesting part. All 3 companies immediately called me to ask what the hell was going on. They wanted to know if there was some kind of ownership dispute or fraud investigation they should know about. Simon closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. Chad's amateur detective work had potentially damaged relationships that Simon had spent years building. In the restaurant industry, reputation and trust were everything. Even the suggestion of impropriety could have lasting consequences. There's more, Dave continued. I also got a call from Marcus Hendricks, Chad's boss at Hendricks and Associates. Apparently, Chad used his company phone to make some of these calls, and someone there monitors outgoing communications for compliance purposes. Angela grabbed Simon's arm. That's why Rita wants to meet. Chad's in trouble at work. Simon put the phone on speaker. Dave, what exactly did Hendricks say? He was fishing for information about whether Chad was involved in some kind of business dispute that might reflect poorly on their company. I kept it professional, but he seemed to think Chad might be having mental health issues. The phrase hung in the air like a revelation. Angela had been watching her brother's behavior escalate over the past few months, but she'd attributed it to stress about his promotion. Now she was wondering if something deeper was wrong. Did you tell Hendricks anything specific? Simon asked. Just that Chad had been asking questions about your business holdings after what seemed to be a misunderstanding at dinner. I didn't mention the harassment or the threats. Figured you'd want to handle that part yourself. After Dave hung up, Angela and Simon sat in silence, both processing the implications of what they'd just learned. He's self-destructing, Angela said finally. Chad's so desperate to prove you're not as successful as you appear that he's jeopardizing his own job. Simon nodded, but his expression was troubled. The question is whether this is just poor judgment or something more serious. The escalation pattern is concerning. Angela's phone buzzed with another message from Rita. Please come. Chad won't listen to me, and I think he's about to make things much worse. She's scared, Angela observed. Rita's never asked me for help before. Simon looked at his wife with the calculating expression she was learning to recognize. What if we went to this meeting? You mean both of us? I mean all of us. Chad, Rita, you, me, and Marcus Hendricks. Everyone in the same room, all the cards on the table. Angela stared at him. That would be nuclear, Simon finished. But it would also end this once and for all. Chad's been operating on assumptions and half-truths for 3 years. Time to show him the complete picture. The idea was both terrifying and appealing. Angela had been watching her brother wage psychological warfare against her husband for years, always hoping things would somehow improve on their own. But Simon was offering something different, a direct confrontation with witnesses and consequences. What would you say to him, she asked. Simon pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Marcus Hendricks' information. I'd tell him the truth. About the restaurants, about Chad's behavior, about the harassment of my employees. Let him draw his own conclusions. Angela felt a mixture of excitement and guilt. Part of her wanted to see Chad face consequences for his behavior, but another part still felt protective of her little brother. He could lose his job, she said. He could lose his job anyway, based on what he's already done. At least this way, he'd know exactly why it happened. Simon's logic was sound, but Angela needed a moment to process the magnitude of what they were considering. This wasn't just about winning an argument or settling a score. It was about fundamentally altering the power dynamics in their family. Her phone rang, and Rita's name appeared on the screen. Answer it, Simon said, but put it on speaker. Rita's voice was tight with stress when she spoke. Angela, thank God. I don't know what to do. Chad's been on the phone all morning, and now his boss wants to meet with both of us this afternoon. He thinks Chad might be having some kind of breakdown. What exactly has Chad been saying? Angela asked. He keeps insisting that Simon was lying about owning that restaurant, that it was some kind of elaborate hoax. He's been calling people, trying to prove it, and apparently use his work phone for some of the calls. Angela met Simon's eyes across the kitchen counter. He nodded slightly, giving her permission to make the offer. Rita, what if Simon and I came to this meeting? Maybe we can clear up the confusion. Silence on the other end. Then Rita's voice, smaller and more uncertain. Would Simon be willing to do that? After everything that happened? Simon leaned toward the phone. Rita, it's Simon. I'll come to the meeting if you think it would help. But I need you to understand something. I'm going to tell the truth about everything. Chad's behavior, the harassment of my employees, all of it. More silence, longer this time. The harassment. Rita's voice was barely a whisper. He called several of my restaurants this morning, trying to convince my employees that I was lying about owning them. He also sent me threatening text messages. This stopped being a family disagreement the moment he involved my business. Angela could hear Rita crying softly on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. I didn't know about the threats. He just said he was trying to understand what happened last night. Rita, Angela said gently, has Chad been acting differently lately? More aggressive, more paranoid? Yes, Rita admitted immediately. Ever since he heard about his promotion, he's been obsessed with proving he's as successful as Simon. It's like he can't let it go. Simon and Angela exchanged glances. The pattern was becoming clearer. Chad's behavior wasn't just about sibling rivalry anymore. It had evolved into something more concerning, a fixation that was affecting his judgment and his ability to function normally. What time is the meeting? Simon asked. 2:00. At Chad's office. We'll be there, Simon said. But Rita, I need you to understand something. I'm not going there to help Chad keep his job. I'm going there to make sure everyone understands exactly what's been happening. After they hung up, Angela looked at her husband with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. You realize this could destroy my relationship with my brother permanently? Simon took her hands in his. Angela, your brother destroyed your relationship with your brother. I'm just going to make sure everyone else knows what he did. Angela nodded slowly, feeling a sense of resolution settle over her. For 3 years, she'd been trying to balance loyalty to her family with loyalty to her husband. But Chad had made that balance impossible to maintain. Okay, she said, let's go finish this. Simon's smile was sharp and determined. Let's go finish this. Neither of them spoke about what would happen after the meeting, but both understood that by the time they left Marcus Hendrick's office that afternoon, Chad's carefully constructed life would be in ruins. The trap was set, and Chad had walked into it willingly. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The offices of Hendricks and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower in Manhattan's financial district. As Simon and Angela rode the elevator up, Angela gripped her husband's hand tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Last chance to back out, Simon said quietly. No. Angela's voice was steady despite her obvious nerves. Chad made his choices. Now he gets to live with the consequences. The elevator opened to reveal a reception area designed to impress clients. Marble floors, expensive artwork, and a commanding view of the city skyline. The receptionist, a young woman named Jeannie Harrison according to her nameplate, looked up with professional courtesy. Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald? Mr. Hendricks is expecting you. Conference room B, just down the hall. As they walked toward the meeting, Simon could hear raised voices behind the closed door. Chad's voice was dominant, defensive, and increasingly agitated. This is insane, Marcus. You're taking the word of someone who's clearly lying about his business holdings over your own employee. Chad, I need you to lower your voice. Marcus Hendrick's response was measured but firm. We're here to discuss facts, not accusations. Simon knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. The conference room fell silent as he and Angela stepped inside. Chad was pacing near the windows, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. Rita sat at the conference table, her eyes red from crying. Marcus Hendricks stood at the head of the table, a distinguished man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect in boardrooms. Mr. Fitzgerald, Hendricks said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. I'm Marcus Hendricks, Chad's supervisor. Simon shook his hand while observing Chad's reaction. His brother-in-law looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between Simon and Hendricks as if trying to calculate the best angle of attack. This is my wife, Angela, Simon said. Chad's sister. Hendricks nodded respectfully to Angela, then gestured for everyone to sit. Chad remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. Before we begin, Hendricks said, I want to make it clear that this meeting is being recorded for HR purposes. Everyone here consents to that, correct? Simon and Angela nodded. Rita whispered her agreement. Chad looked like he wanted to object, but seemed to realize he had no choice. Chad, Hendricks continued, you've made some serious allegations about Mr. Fitzgerald's business practices. You've also used company resources to investigate these claims. I need to understand exactly what's happening here. Chad finally sat down, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Marcus, my brother-in-law has been lying about owning restaurants for years. Last night, he orchestrated some kind of elaborate scam to make me look foolish in public. Simon pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. Would you like to see the ownership documents for Le Bernardin? I have the purchase agreement, the liquor license, the business registration, all dated 18 months ago. Those could be forged, Chad said quickly. Hendricks raised an eyebrow. Chad, are you seriously suggesting that Mr. Fitzgerald forged legal documents to win an argument with you? I'm saying something doesn't add up. People don't just secretly own famous restaurants. Simon scrolled through his phone and pulled up a Forbes article from 6 months earlier. The headline read, Rising Restaurant Empire, Simon Fitzgerald's Quiet Expansion Strategy. He slid the phone across to Hendricks. This article lists 12 of my restaurants, including Le Bernardin. Forbes verified ownership before publication. Hendricks read the article quickly, his expression growing more concerned as he absorbed the details. According to the piece, Simon's restaurant empire was worth an estimated $47 million. Chad, Hendricks said slowly, this article describes Mr. Fitzgerald as one of the most successful restaurateurs on the East Coast. It includes quotes from industry leaders and detailed financial analysis. Chad leaned forward desperately. Anyone can pay for press coverage. This doesn't prove anything. Simon's patience finally snapped. He'd endured 3 years of Chad's psychological warfare, but watching him dismiss legitimate business journalism as paid propaganda was too much. Marcus, Simon said, his voice deadly calm, I need to tell you about Chad's behavior over the past 24 hours. He methodically detailed Chad's harassment campaign, the calls to restaurants, the attempts to turn employees against him, the threatening text messages. With each revelation, Hendricks' expression grew darker and Chad's face grew paler. You sent threatening text messages? Hendricks asked. Chad's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Rita was staring at her husband with horror, clearly hearing about the threats for the first time. Simon pulled up the text thread and showed it to Hendricks. This isn't over. You made me look like a fool last night, and I don't forget things like that. This was sent at 8:30 this morning, Simon said, followed by 6 more messages over the next 3 hours, all of them increasingly hostile. Hendricks studied the messages with the expression of a man watching a career implode. Chad, did you send these messages? I was upset, Chad said weakly. I didn't mean. You didn't mean to threaten a successful businessman because you were embarrassed at dinner? Hendricks' voice was ice cold. You didn't mean to use company phones to harass his employees? You didn't mean to make accusations of fraud without a shred of evidence. Rita finally spoke up, her voice barely audible. Chad, what have you done? Angela reached across the table and took Rita's hand. Rita, there's something else you need to know. She pulled out her own phone and showed Rita the LinkedIn post Chad had been making about Simon over the past few months. Posts that questioned his business acumen, suggested his success was unearned, and made subtle digs about fake entrepreneurs. He's been conducting a public campaign against Simon for months, Angela said. I only found them this morning when I started looking. Hendricks was now scrolling through the posts on his own phone, his face growing darker with each one he read. Chad, these posts violate our social media policy in multiple ways. You've made disparaging comments about what you're now claiming is a $47 million business empire, and you've done it while employed by this company. Chad was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his situation. His face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray color. Marcus, I can explain. Explain what? Hendricks stood up, his patience clearly exhausted. Explain why you've spent months harassing a client's family member? Explain why you used company resources to investigate personal vendettas? Explain why you've potentially exposed this company to liability for your bizarre behavior. Simon felt a moment of sympathy for Chad, watching him realize that his 3-year campaign of psychological warfare had just cost him everything. But the sympathy was brief. Chad had brought this entirely on himself. There's one more thing, Simon said quietly. He pulled out a business card and slid it across the table to Hendricks. The card read, Fitzgerald Hospitality Group, Strategic Consulting and Investment Services. We've been considering Hendricks and Associates for our corporate catering contracts, Simon said. About $2 million annually across all our properties. The room fell completely silent. Hendricks stared at the card, then at Simon, then at Chad with an expression of pure disbelief. You've been harassing a potential $2 million client. Hendrick's voice was barely controlled fury. For 3 years, Chad slumped in his chair, finally understanding that he hadn't just lost an argument. He'd potentially cost his company millions of dollars in business. Marcus, Chad said desperately, I didn't know. You didn't know because you never bothered to ask, Angela interrupted, her own anger finally breaking through her composed exterior. You assumed. You assumed Simon was lying. You assumed his success was fake. You assumed you could tear him down without consequences. She stood up, her voice growing stronger. My husband has never said a bad word about you to anyone. He's endured 3 years of your insults and psychological abuse because he didn't want to hurt me. But you couldn't leave it alone, could you? You had to keep pushing until you destroyed everything. Rita was crying openly now, staring at her husband with a mixture of horror and disappointment. Hendricks cleared his throat. Chad, I think it's best if you clear out your office today. Security will escort you out. We'll discuss the terms of your termination through HR. Chad's career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His marriage was in jeopardy. All because he couldn't accept that his brother-in-law was more successful than he was. As Simon and Angela prepared to leave, Hendricks stopped them. Mr. Fitzgerald, I hope this incident won't affect your consideration of our company for your catering needs. Simon looked back at Chad, who was sitting in stunned silence, then at Hendricks. I think we can probably work something out, he said. The trap had worked perfectly. Chad's own behavior had been the bait, and his own choices had sprung the mechanism. The war was over. Simon had won without ever having to fire a shot. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. 2 weeks after the meeting at Hendricks & Associates, Simon sat in his home office reviewing quarterly reports when Angela knocked on the door. Her expression was troubled in a way he'd rarely seen. Rita's here, she said. She wants to talk to both of us. Simon found Rita in their living room, looking like she'd aged years in the past 2 weeks. Her usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by dark circles under her eyes and clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. Thank you for seeing me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I probably don't have the right to ask for anything after what Chad did. Angela sat across from her, while Simon remained standing near the window. The dynamic in the room was different now. Rita was no longer Chad's co-conspirator, but a victim of his behavior. How is he? Angela asked, though her tone suggested she was asking out of obligation rather than genuine concern. Rita's composure cracked slightly. Not good. He's been drinking more, sleeping all day. He keeps saying this is all Simon's fault, that you set him up somehow. Simon felt a flare of anger, but kept his voice level. Did he tell you about the job interviews? Rita nodded miserably. For companies. All of them withdrew their offers once they called Hendricks for references. Marcus told them about the harassment and the social media posts. Word had spread quickly through the industry. Chad's behavior had been so egregious that Marcus Hendricks felt obligated to warn other potential employers about the liability he might represent. Rita, Angela said gently, why are you here? Rita took a shuddering breath. Because I need to understand what really happened. Chad tells me one story, but after everything I saw in that meeting, I don't think I can trust his version anymore. She pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the coffee table. I found these in his desk at home. He's been documenting everything about Simon for months. Angela opened the folder and stared at its contents in shock. Chad had been conducting an investigation worthy of a private detective, screenshots of social media posts, printed articles about Simon's restaurants, financial speculation based on public records, even photographs taken at family gatherings with notes about Simon's clothing and behavior. Jesus, Angela breathed. This is obsessive, Simon finished. He'd known Chad's behavior was concerning, but this suggested something closer to stalking than sibling rivalry. Rita wiped tears from her eyes. There are spreadsheets tracking Simon's restaurant acquisitions, theories about how he's financing them, even notes about your marriage and whether Angela knows about the fake business empire. Simon sat down, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd been dealing with. Chad hadn't just been taking opportunistic shots at family gatherings. He'd been conducting a systematic campaign to prove Simon was a fraud. "Rita," he said carefully, "has Chad ever talked about hurting me? Physically, I mean." Rita's silence was answer enough. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. "He talked about exposing you, about finding proof that you were lying and making sure everyone knew. He said you'd made him look stupid in front of our friends for years, and it was time for payback." Angela was flipping through more pages of Chad's documentation. Some of these photos were taken at private family events. Christmas dinner, birthday parties. "Rita, he was studying Simon like he was a criminal." The scope of Chad's obsession was staggering. He'd been building a case against Simon based on nothing but jealousy and wounded pride, creating elaborate theories to explain away success he couldn't accept as legitimate. "There's something else," Rita said reluctantly. She pulled out her phone and showed them a series of text messages. "He's been in contact with your competitors, the restaurant Simon called about ownership verification. He's trying to convince them to investigate Simon's business practices." Simon's blood ran cold. Chad was now actively trying to damage his professional relationships based on nothing but spite. "Show me," he said. Rita scrolled through the messages, each one more damaging than the last. Chad was suggesting Simon was involved in money laundering, that his restaurant empire was built on illegal activities, that his success was too rapid to be legitimate. "He's going to destroy innocent people's businesses with these accusations," Simon said. "My employees, my investors, even my customers could be affected if this spreads." Angela looked up from Chad's documents with pure fury in her eyes. "He's not just attacking you anymore. He's attacking everyone connected to you." Simon stood up and walked to his home office, returning with a thick legal folder. "Rita, I need you to understand something. This isn't just family drama anymore. Chad's behavior has crossed into criminal territory." He opened the folder and showed her the documentation Julia's car had prepared. Harassment charges, defamation claims, interference with business operations, and now potentially criminal conspiracy to damage a business through false accusations. "We have grounds to file charges against Chad for what he's already done," Simon said. "If he continues contacting my competitors or business partners, I'll have no choice but to pursue them." Rita stared at the legal documents with growing horror. "He could go to jail?" "Yes," Simon said without hesitation. "And if his false accusations cost me any business relationships or contracts, the civil damages could bankrupt him." Angela closed Chad's folder and looked at Rita with something approaching pity. "Rita, you need to get him help. Professional help. This level of obsession isn't normal." Rita was crying again, but this time her tears seemed to carry relief as well as grief. "I know. I've been telling myself it was just sibling rivalry, but this..." She gestured toward the folder. "This is insane." Simon felt the weight of the moment. He could destroy Chad completely, file the criminal charges, pursue civil damages, make sure he never worked in any professional capacity again. Chad had certainly earned that level of consequences. But looking at Rita, seeing the genuine distress and recognition in her eyes, Simon made a different choice. "Rita, I'm going to make you an offer. One time only." She looked up hopefully. "Get Chad into therapy. Real therapy, not just anger management. If he can acknowledge what he's done and get professional help for his obsession, I won't file criminal charges." Angela stared at her husband with surprise, but didn't object. "However," Simon continued, "if he makes one more contact with my employees, my competitors, or anyone in my professional network, all bets are off. And if he ever threatens me or my family again, I'll use every legal resource at my disposal to ensure he faces full consequences." Rita nodded eagerly. "I'll make sure he understands." "Thank you, Simon. This is more generous than he deserves." "It's not generosity," Simon replied. "It's practicality. Chad needs help, not revenge." "But Rita, you need to understand something. He's burned every bridge with his family. Even if he gets help, even if he changes, things will never go back to the way they were." Rita stood to leave, clutching Chad's folder like evidence of a crime she was finally ready to report. At the door, she turned back. "Simon, can I ask you something? Why didn't you ever fight back? All those years Chad was taking shots at you. You could have ended at any time. Why didn't you?" Simon looked at Angela, then back at Rita. because I hoped he'd eventually realize that success isn't a zero-sum game, that him winning didn't require me to lose. I kept thinking he'd mature out of the jealousy. And now, Simon's expression hardened. Now I realize some people will never stop trying to tear others down. They have to be stopped. After Rita left, Angela and Simon sat in their living room processing what they'd learned. Chad's obsession had been far more extensive than either of them had realized. "Do you think he'll actually get help?" Angela asked. "I think Rita will make sure he does," Simon replied. "She finally sees what she married." Angela leaned against her husband's shoulder. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For not seeing what he was doing. For not protecting you from it." Simon kissed the top of her head. "You see it now. That's what matters." Outside their window, the city sparkled with lights and possibilities. Chad's war was over, but Simon's empire would continue to grow. Success, it turned out, really was the best revenge. But more importantly, he had his wife's complete loyalty and support for the first time in their marriage. That was worth more than any business victory. The battle was won. The war was over. And Simon Fitzgerald had emerged stronger than ever. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months after the confrontation at Hendricks & Associates, Simon stood in the kitchen of his newest restaurant, watching his head chef prepare for the evening service. The Meridian Room's flagship location had just received its second Michelin star, and reservations were booked solid through the end of the year. Angela appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the kind of smile that had first caught his attention years ago. "Celebrating alone?" she asked, handing him a glass. "Celebrating with the most important person in my life," he corrected, pulling her close. Their relationship had transformed completely since the Chad crisis. Angela now took active interest in his business empire, attending investor meetings and offering insights that consistently impressed his partners. More importantly, she'd become his true confidant and strategic advisor, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "Any word from Rita?" Angela asked, though her tone suggested she was asking more out of curiosity than concern. Simon nodded. "She sent me a thank you note. Chad completed his therapy program and found a job at a small accounting firm in Vermont. Apparently, he's been sober for 4 months." The news was genuinely good. Chad had spent 3 months in intensive therapy, followed by ongoing counseling that had helped him understand the destructive nature of his obsession. According to Rita, he'd written Simon a lengthy apology letter, which Simon had chosen not to read, and was working to rebuild his life on more stable foundations. "Do you think he's really changed?" Angela asked. Simon considered the question seriously. "I think he understands consequences now. Whether that translates to genuine change remains to be seen." The truth was, Simon rarely thought about Chad anymore. His brother-in-law had been a problem that required solving, and once solved, he'd become largely irrelevant to Simon's life. There was no lingering anger or desire for revenge, just the satisfaction of knowing that bullies eventually faced accountability. Dave Miller knocked on the kitchen door, interrupting their quiet moment. "Boss, sorry to interrupt, but I've got those quarterly reports you wanted. Also, Marcus Hendricks is here, says he has something he wants to discuss with you personally." Simon raised an eyebrow. The catering contract with Hendricks & Associates had been highly successful, but Marcus rarely requested personal meetings. They found Marcus in the restaurant's private dining room, looking remarkably different than he had during their confrontational meeting months earlier. He stood and shook hands warmly with both Simon and Angela. "Thank you for seeing me," Marcus said. "I wanted to discuss a business proposition, but first I owe you both an apology." "For what?" Angela asked. "For not recognizing what Chad was doing sooner. The social media posts, the harassment of your employees, the threatening messages. It all should have been flagged by our HR department months before it reached the crisis point." Simon waved off the concern. "Marcus, you can't monitor every employee's personal vendettas. Chad was careful to keep most of his behavior outside work hours. Nevertheless, we've implemented new policies based on what happened. Social media monitoring, better protocols for identifying harassment patterns, clearer guidelines about using company resources for personal matters." Marcus pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "Which brings me to my proposition. I'd like to hire you as a consultant to help other companies develop similar policies. Simon was intrigued despite himself. What kind of consulting? Employee behavior management, crisis prevention, reputation protection. The Chad situation showed us gaps in our systems that probably exist in hundreds of other companies. Your handling of a situation was masterful. You documented everything, built an airtight case, and resolved it without destroying anyone unnecessarily. Angela looked at her husband with interest. You want Simon to teach other companies how to handle workplace bullies and harassment? Exactly. But more than that, I want him to help companies recognize the early warning signs before situations escalate to the point Chad's did. Simon had to admit the idea was appealing. His experience with Chad had taught him a lot about psychology, documentation, and strategic response to harassment. Translating those lessons into a consulting framework could help other people avoid similar situations. What would this involve, he asked. Marcus opened his folder and pulled out a preliminary proposal. 20 companies have already expressed interest based on our preliminary discussions. The consulting fees would be substantial, but more importantly, you'd be helping create healthier workplace environments. Simon scanned the proposal, noting that several Fortune 500 companies were on the list. The potential impact, both financial and social, was significant. I'll need to think about it, he said. My restaurant empire keeps me pretty busy. Of course. But Simon, you've got a unique combination of business acumen, psychological insight, and practical experience with harassment situations. That's rare. After Marcus left, Simon and Angela remained in the private dining room, discussing the unexpected opportunity. It's appealing, Angela said. You'd be helping people while building another revenue stream. Simon nodded, but something else was occupying his thoughts. Angela, can I ask you something? Are you happy with how everything worked out? She looked at him with surprise. What do you mean? With Chad, with your family. I know ending that relationship was painful for you. Angela was quiet for a long moment, swirling her champagne as she considered the question. Chad made his own choices, she said finally. I spent years trying to protect him from the consequences, but that wasn't actually helping him. It was just enabling more destructive behavior. She reached across the table and took Simon's hand. I'm happy that I finally chose to protect my husband instead of my brother's feelings. I'm happy that we're finally on the same team. And I'm proud of how you handled everything. You could have destroyed him, but you gave him a chance to get help instead. Simon squeezed her hand, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Chad's psychological warfare had been meant to tear them apart, but ultimately, it had made their marriage stronger. So what do you think about the consulting offer? He asked. Angela's smile was mischievous. I think you should do it, but only if I get to be your business partner. Someone needs to keep you from being too generous with people who probably don't deserve it. Simon laughed, remembering how she'd stood up to Chad in that final confrontation. Angela had evolved from someone who avoided conflict to someone who faced it head-on when necessary. Partners? He asked, extending his hand for a formal shake. Partners, she agreed. As they walked through the restaurant toward the exit, Simon reflected on how much had changed since that dinner at La Bernardine. Chad's attempt to humiliate him had backfired spectacularly, but more importantly, it had revealed strength